All right, everyone, get ready for another deep dive. Today we are taking a deep dive into Angela Duckworth's Grit, the power of passion and perseverance.
Yeah, it's one of those books that I think can really change how you see success.
I totally agree. We always hear so much about talent being the key,
Mhm.
but Duckworth kind of flips the script on that whole idea. She makes a case for grit as the secret to really achieving big goals, this fascinating combo of passion and perseverance.
It's not just about like short bursts of effort either.
Definitely
That's
not.
that long game, that stamina to stick with something for the long haul.
That makes total sense. So before we get too far into it, let's break down what exactly grit means in Duckworth's view.
Well, for Duckworth, grit is this combination of passion and perseverance, but it's for really long-term goals. Like we're talking years, even decades of dedication to something. It's that fire in your belly that keeps you going even when things get tough.
So it's like having a fire in your belly, but also the strength to keep fanning the flames even when the going gets tough?
Exactly. And that's what sets it apart from talent. Duckworth argues that we're obsessed with talent as a society, but it's actually grit that predicts achievement.
That's pretty interesting. So are you saying that someone with less raw talent could actually outperform someone who's naturally gifted if they have more grit?
That's exactly what she's saying, yeah. And she has a lot of research to back it up.
Wow, okay. So what kind of research?
Well, one really cool example is the grit test that they use at West Point. They actually use this test to try to predict which cadets will make it through Beast Barracks, that brutal summer training they're famous for.
Wait a minute, they have a test for grit. What does that even look like?
I know, it's pretty wild. What's really fascinating, though, is that this grit test is a better predictor of success than, like, physical fitness scores or even IQ.
Whoa. So mental toughness beats out everything else. I can see why Duckworth might say that grit is so powerful.
Oh, absolutely. And there are a ton of other examples in the book, like she studied the National Spelling Bee, too.
Yep.
And what she found was that the kids who had this really, like, deliberate practice routine, the ones who focused on their weaknesses and worked at it consistently,
Uh-huh.
they actually did better than the kids who just had this, like, natural ability with words.
So it was more about how they approached it than just having a big vocabulary.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. But how does all this actually work? Like, is there a formula for success that she lays out in the book?
There is, and it's surprisingly simple but super powerful. She says that talent multiplied by effort equals skill. So your natural ability plus your hard work equals the skills you develop.
Okay, I'm following so far.
But here's the thing. It doesn't stop there. Then she says skill multiplied by effort again
Huh.
equals achievement.
Hold on. Effort shows up twice in this formula.
It does, and that's super important because what it means is that someone with less talent but more effort can actually outperform someone with more talent but less effort.
Hmm.
Like, it completely changes the whole you're either born with it or you're not idea.
Wow. That's a lot to think about. So if grit is this important, can you actually learn to be grittier? Or are you just kind of stuck with what you've got?
That's the good news. Grit isn't some fixed trait. It's more like a muscle. You can actually build it up.
All right, listeners, get those notebooks ready. This is where it gets good.
So the first thing is to cultivate what's called a growth mindset.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but remind me what it means exactly.
Basically, it means believing that you can get better at things through effort and practice. And it also means reframing failures, seeing them as opportunities to learn and grow.
So instead of saying, I'm bad at this, you say, I can get better at this with practice.
Right. And that's key for building grit because it helps you see those challenges as a chance to get stronger, not a reason to give up.
Yeah, I can see how that would make a big difference in how you approach things. What else can people do to develop this growth mindset and boost their grit?
Well, another big thing is finding your passion. When you're genuinely interested in something, it's just easier to persevere, right? You're more likely to push through the tough stuff.
It's like you're driven by something bigger than just fleeting motivation.
Exactly. It becomes about more than just willpower. It's about aligning your effort with something that really matters to you.
So how do you actually figure out what you're passionate about?
Duckworth talks about reflecting on your past experiences. Think about what you genuinely enjoy doing, what you were drawn to as a kid, or what makes you lose track of time now. Those can be really helpful clues.
It's like looking for those things that make you feel truly alive and energized. But what about people who are already on a path they're not super passionate about, like a job they took for the money but don't love? Can you still be gritty in those situations?
Oh, totally. Grit isn't limited to like some dream career or grand passion. You can apply it to any area where you need to stick with something.
So even if you aren't in your dream job, you can still find ways to be gritty.
For sure. It might mean connecting your work to your values in a new way, or maybe seeing it as a stepping stone to something you're more passionate about down the road. Even if you don't love every single task, you can still approach it with that growth mindset we talked about.
That's a really helpful perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, I feel like we've only just scratched the surface here. There's so much more to this whole grit thing.
I know, right? We could talk about this stuff all day.
Unfortunately, we're out of time for this part of our deep dive, but we will be back soon to explore the potential downsides of being too gritty and how organizations can create a culture of grit. And of course, even more practical tips for how you can cultivate this powerful trait in your own life.
Gonna be good. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Angela Duckworth's Grit. We've been talking about this idea that it's not just talent, but this blend of passion and perseverance grit that really drives success.
And we've seen how grit plays out in these crazy high-stakes environments like West Point, even the National Spelling Bee.
Yeah, those are really fascinating examples. But I'm curious, is there ever a point where grit can be too much of a good thing? Like, could you be too gritty?
That's such a good question. And yet, Duckworth actually addresses that in the book. Because it's easy to think, right? Like, more grit, always better.
Right.
But it's like any powerful tool, you got to use it wisely.
So there are downsides to being super gritty. What would those be?
Well, think about someone who's so focused on a goal that they just miss other opportunities. Or they push themselves so hard that they burn out.
Oh, yeah, like they forget to take care of themselves or even damage relationships along the way.
Exactly. And that's where it can be dangerous. Sometimes the grittiest thing you can do is actually step back, reassess, maybe even walk away from something.
So it's not just about blindly pushing forward, it's about being smart about where you put your energy.
Totally. And that takes self-awareness. Regularly checking in with yourself, asking if you're on the right track, if your efforts still align with what you value.
That makes a lot of sense. It makes me think about the whole idea of failure, too. Duckworth talks a lot about having a growth mindset, right?
Yeah.
So how does that play into being gritty, especially when things don't go your way?
Well, I think failure is just part of any journey,
Right.
especially when it takes grit. But with a growth mindset, you see failure as feedback, a chance to learn and get better.
So you're not afraid to fail. You actually embrace it.
Yeah. It's about learning from those setbacks and using them to grow. It's funny, there's this line from the book that really stuck with me. She says, "Enthusiasm is common, endurance is rare."
Ooh, I like that.
It's easy to get excited about something when you first start out, but it's that ability to stick with it, even when it gets tough, that defines grit.
That's so true. It's like the difference between a fireworks display, all flashy and over quickly, and a pilot light that just keeps burning steady.
I love that analogy. It's perfect. And it goes back to finding your passion.
Right, we talked about that earlier.
Yeah. When you're truly passionate about something, that endurance just comes naturally.
It's like having this internal source of energy that fuels your grit. But for people who haven't found their passion yet, what would you say to them?
Duckworth says, look at your past experiences. What have you truly enjoyed? What were you drawn to as a kid? What still makes you lose track of time? Those are all good places to start.
It's like doing a little self-archaeology, digging up those hidden interests and seeing if they still resonate.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to try new things. Take a class, explore a new hobby. You never know what might spark your passion.
So even if you haven't found that one thing yet, you can still take steps to discover it. That's good to know.
Yeah. And once you do find it, that passion can become a powerful engine for your grit.
This whole idea of passion as fuel for grit is so cool. But I'm thinking about people who might be on a path that they're not super passionate about, maybe a job they need for financial reasons. Can you still develop grit even without that intrinsic motivation?
Absolutely. Remember, grit isn't just about chasing some grand dream career, right? It's a skill that can be applied anywhere you need to persevere, even in a job you don't love.
So you can still find ways to be gritty, even if you're not doing your dream job.
For sure. You can try connecting your work to your values, or maybe seeing it as a stepping stone to something you're more passionate about in the future. And even if you don't love every single task, you can still approach it with that growth mindset we talked about.
Finding those little pockets of purpose, even in something that's not inherently exciting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's important because grit isn't just an individual thing. It can also be cultivated at an organizational level.
Hmm.
Duckworth actually talks about fostering a culture of grit within teams and companies.
Culture of grit. That's interesting. So it's not just about each individual being gritty, it's about creating an environment that supports that.
Exactly. Think about the examples we talked about before West Point, the Seattle Seahawks. They're known for being tough, but also really supportive. They set high expectations, but they give people the tools and mentorship to help them succeed.
So it's not about grinding people down, it's about providing the right kind of support.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that setbacks happen and that learning from failure is important.
So not a pressure cooker environment, more like a greenhouse, helping people to grow.
I like that. And it highlights the importance of feeling safe.
Safe.
Yeah, psychological safety. People need to feel safe to take risks, to experiment, to fail without being punished for it.
So it's not about just being tough all the time. It's about creating an environment where people feel supported and empowered to push themselves.
Exactly. And that's where leaders play a huge role. They set the tone, they model the behavior, and they build systems that either encourage grit or discourage it.
So grit isn't just a personal quality, it's something that organizations can foster too. That's fascinating.
Absolutely. And it's something we can all think about. Whether we're leading a team, raising a family, or just working towards our own goals, we can create those environments that nurture grit.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. We've covered so much ground. But one thing we haven't really talked about is the role of talent. Does Duckworth just completely dismiss it?
That's a good question. And to be fair, she doesn't say that talent doesn't matter at all,
Okay.
but she challenges the idea that it's the only thing that
So it's
matters.
not an either, it's more of a both hand.
Exactly. Talent might give you a head start,
Yeah.
but grit is what determines how far you'll go. It's what turns potential into achievement.
So talent gets you to the starting line, but grit gets you across the finish line.
Perfectly put. And that's an empowering message, don't you think? We might not all be born with amazing talent, but we can all cultivate grit.
This has been amazing. But I have one last question. We've talked about how to develop grit, but what about genetics and upbringing? Are some people just naturally grittier than others?
Ooh, that's a good one. And researchers are still looking into that, but Duckworth does acknowledge that both nature and nurture play a role in shaping our personalities, including our grit.
So it's not entirely one or the other. It's a little bit of both.
It seems like it. We'll unpack that last layer and leave you with some actionable takeaways in the final part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've spent this whole episode exploring Angela Duckworth's grit, the power of passion and perseverance.
And I think we've learned a lot about why grit is so important, for achieving those long-term goals we all have, and even how companies can create a culture that actually helps people develop more grit.
Totally. We've also talked about how being super gritty isn't always a good thing.
Right, exactly. You know when to reassess, maybe when to step back.
Exactly. But before we finish up, there's one thing I'm still kind of curious about. We've talked about how to develop more grit, but what about that whole nature versus nurture thing? Are some people just, like, born grittier than others?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think the honest answer is, it's complicated. Duckworth does say that both genetics and our experiences, like how we were raised, all play part. There's some research suggesting that some people might inherit genes that make them a little more predisposed to, perseverance and resilience.
So there might be a grit gene, but does that mean if you don't have it, you're just out of luck?
Well, luckily, no. Duckworth really emphasizes that even if you are genetically predisposed to be a little grittier, it's not set in stone. Our experiences, especially when we're young, can really shape how we approach challenges later on.
Oh, that's good news. So even if you don't have that grit gene, you can still develop grit through your experiences and choices.
Exactly. Think of it like building muscle. Some people might be born with a natural advantage, like bigger muscles. But anyone can build strength with the right kind of training and effort. Grit is kind of like that. It's not fixed. You can change it.
Okay, that makes sense. So if we want to train our grit muscles, what are some things we can actually do? We've talked about a growth mindset and finding your passion, but are there any other exercises or tips Duckworth recommends?
Yeah, she's got a ton of great strategies. One we haven't mentioned yet is deliberate practice. And that's not just about putting in the hours.
Right.
It's about being really intentional. Breaking a skill down into smaller parts and focusing on very specific areas to improve.
So instead of just reading a book, maybe I highlight key passages, take notes, like really engage with it.
Exactly. It's about having that focus and seeking feedback to help you get better, like
Mm.
having a personalized training plan, but for your grit.
It sounds like that takes a lot of discipline. How do you stay motivated to actually do that,
Yeah.
especially when it gets hard?
Oh, that's a great point. I think one thing that's really important is to celebrate the small wins. It's so easy to get focused on the end goal that you forget to, appreciate the progress you make along the way.
Yeah, you got to enjoy the journey too, right?
For sure. And those little victories can give you the motivation to keep going, especially when you're in it for the long haul. But it's not all on you either. The people around you matter.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, surround yourself with people who support your goals and who embody the values of grit and perseverance. It makes a huge difference.
Find your tribe of gritty people.
Exactly. Mentors, colleagues, friends, family. Having that supportive network can be a game changer. They can encourage you when you're doubting yourself, and they can hold you accountable.
It's like having a cheerleading squad for your grit journey.
Exactly. And they celebrate your wins with you.
This has been such an amazing deep dive. I think the most important thing I've learned is that grit isn't this magical quality only some people have. It's something we can all develop and build up.
I'm so glad you said that.
Hmm.
That's exactly what Duckworth's work shows us. We actually have a lot more power than we think to shape our own destinies.
And it's never too late to start working on it. So, to all our listeners out there, what's one area in your life where you could use a little more grit?
Think about it. What's one small step you can take this week? Maybe it's setting a tough goal. Or maybe it's just committing to showing up consistently, even when you don't feel like it.
You don't have to do it all at once. Start small, build that momentum, and don't forget to celebrate those little wins along the way.
You'll be amazed at what you can achieve with a little bit of grit.
Thanks so much for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.